Hello, and welcome to MIT Sloan Alumni Online. Every month, MIT Sloan Alumni Online brings you the latest breaking news, cutting-edge research, groundbreaking ideas, and school updates from MIT Sloan faculty and alumni. Today, we are pleased to have Bryn Panee Burkhart with us again for the third in our three-part series on careers, this time focusing on compensation conversations. Bryn is the Senior Associate Director of Alumni Career Services here at MIT Sloan. She joined the Sloan School in 2006 and has been our dedicated alumni career coach since 2012. She has been a great partner to the Office of External Relations and a tremendous resource for our alumni. In fact, we just celebrated Reunion, where Bryn hosted 3 different career sessions, including a packed speed networking event, on top of one-on-one consultations with alumni. It's safe to say that Bryn is a rock star, and we're grateful to have her joining us today to once again share her expertise. Bryn, I will now turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Greg, for that very kind introduction. It was really a pleasure to be at Reunion last week. It was wonderful. I always say it's my favorite time of the year because everybody's happy, and it was great to see some old faces and great familiar faces. So. All right, we're going to jump tonight to a new topic. So first of all, welcome everybody. It's great to be here for our third, installment of our career webinar series. The past 2 webinars have focused really on positioning yourself. We did a very strategic webinar, and then we did a very tactical webinar last time with LinkedIn. Tonight we're going to pivot, and we're going to talk about positioning yourself, but we're actually going to put the slant of compensation on it. So let me start by pointing out this elephant image here on the first slide, this green elephant covered in American dollar bills. So talking about money is typically not easy for people. It's like the elephant in the room, right? Or the green elephant in the room. So if you think about your own earning scenario, how many people know your salary? Does your spouse or your partner know? Or your friends or your parents? In Western culture, we're typically closed on the subject of compensation. And let me just acknowledge here that tonight's presentation is skewed with a bent towards North America. So there may be some cultural variations depending where in the world you live and you work. But I guess that talking about compensation is pretty universally a very uncomfortable or at least uncommon subject. And that's because compensation is very complicated. It's complicated and it's complex because every compensation scenario is very specific to your own personal situation, to the company that you're talking to, and to the conditions of the market, right? At specific time, whether the market and the company's position in the market is doing is going to influence your ability to have salary discussions and perhaps negotiations. So I have 4 objectives that I'd like to achieve tonight we're going to talk about for our time together this evening. So first of all, my goal is to take away some of the mystery about how organizations generally approach the subject of compensation. So I'm going to give you an overview of how companies tend to set their compensation structure so that you get some insight into what goes on behind the scenes. Next, I'm going to talk about the very important subject of finding out your own market value. This is going to be very important for any compensation conversation you have. It's critical to know salary ranges for the roles you're aspiring to get to and or roles that might be different than what you currently do. So we'll talk about how to do this research so that you're well prepared for discussions. Next, we're going to look at different types of compensation conversations that you might have so that you can position yourself from a place of strength. If you've attended any of my prior webinars or workshops, you'll notice this is a theme for me. I'm all about having you lead from a place of strength in terms of how you manage your career. It's about intentional, purposeful career management. So in this part of the webinar, I'm going to actually talk about how to tackle questions like, what are you looking for in a base salary? And what is your current compensation? In a way that allows you to be transparent, but also allows you to maintain some leverage in the conversation. And I will say, these conversations and the dialogue in this part are things that you can use even if you're looking for an internal promotion. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up by looking at how to prepare for kind of those final stages of an interview process when you're getting close to receiving an offer, and how will you prepare for the salary negotiations that will follow it. Now, I want to say at the top of this webinar, this is not a salary negotiation webinar, okay? That is a rich and complex subject in its own right, and it merits its own webinar, and I've already talked about doing one in the future. But for tonight, I really want to lay the groundwork and give you a foundation for what you need to know as you are thinking about companies and how to position yourself for an eventual negotiation. So the negotiation itself will not be addressed tonight. All right, let's dive in and start with my first objective, which is really giving you a behind-the-scenes view of what companies look at. Now, what goes into a comp package? Now, every company is going to have their own compensation philosophy, their own attitude towards how they use compensation as a reward system to attract, retain, and promote their talent. Now, when we're talking about comp, we're mainly talking about base salary. This tends to be the meat of the comp package, although, as you may know, in senior level roles or perhaps in small startups, equity can sometimes outstrip that base pay. There are also short-term incentives that you might want to consider, bonuses that are based on performance or sales at the individual level. It could also be spot bonuses or any team or group rewards that you might have. Long-term incentives or equity are typically paid out in cash or equity over a 3 to 5 year period. So this includes stock options, RSUs, which are restricted stock units, and any deferred earnings. And then there are some other benefits and perks, and these might vary significantly depending on where in the world you live. In the U.S., it is still essential for employers of a certain size to offer health care benefits and retirement contributions like 401ks, retirement packages. Other perks that might go on here, depending where you are, housing allowances, transportation allowances. In some countries, these are common. In others, they're non-existent. I know for many U.S. citizens living abroad as an expat, they oftentimes will enjoy more housing allowances, transportation allowances, things like that. All right? So I just want to make it clear tonight that even though the compensation conversations I'm going to focus on will zero in on base salary, since it's pretty much the driver of the compensation package for this audience, compensation is comprised of a package that includes both salary and benefits. And the higher up the ranks you go, sometimes those short and long-term incentives can become a significant part of your earning scenario. Okay, so let's look at how companies tend to go about evaluating the market and setting their compensation structure. These are typically done with compensation analysts whose job it is to help the firm determine what the structure should be or to help update an existing compensation structure. So companies first will decide on their compensation philosophy, which is typically driven by the leader or the leaders of the organization. They consider how the company wants to use its capital. Also, how do they want to structure earnings in a way that will allow for the recruitment of talented candidates that will encourage performance and retention, right, of talent. So they tackle these questions. What do we pay for? How do we pay? How much do we pay? And then they develop tentative peer groups or levels that make sense for the organization. So just to keep it simple, it would be maybe the executive level, a senior level, a middle manager level, a junior level, an entry level, etc. Now, I think it's also important to point out here that how companies approach these questions really reflects their culture. Some companies have a culture of investing in their employees. Financially, but maybe also with some other perks. You know, when I say that, I think about Google and its, playground at work, the free dry cleaning and the free food and the nap stations and things like that, right? Other companies, and I shouldn't have said Google. I mean, there's other companies that do that too. Other companies, however, are known for churning out their talent, right? They don't place a high premium on retention. And the fact is there are financially successful companies in both of those camps. So if you think about your current and past employers and your experience with how they rewarded or did not reward, rather, talent, employees, you could probably see if that culture was reflected in their compensation philosophy. All right. So once the philosophy is determined, now they must figure out the current state of the organization. So they look through position descriptions. They look through the requirements, the bandwidth, what they were looking for in terms of years of experience and education level for each position. They'll typically also look at the reporting structure and get a handle on all the levels and the layers within the current state of the organization. Then, compensation analysts will benchmark the company against the marketplace to ensure that their compensation offerings are enough, but that they're not totally excessive. So in this process, they look at all the things you see here, and they will review their own internal equity vis-a-vis their competitors. So one thing you should know is that every company has a corporate benchmarking study that informs how they will approach and structure and set their compensation. It's typically confidential, right? But it's highly valuable. So for those of you in HR, you might be familiar with this. And, you know, that it's not something that's typically publicly available. And then finally, there's the assessment, once again, based on the compensation philosophy and the company's position in the market, how the organization might want to adjust their compensation practices. So they want to be comparable to their peers, but they also need to evaluate any financial impact that will come after them making these adjustments. And finally, the culmination of all of this is developing new salary bands or pay grades, educating everyone within the organization about changes that are taking place, and then new offers will then be extended that align with the new compensation structure that has been so carefully researched and put together. So that is a quick overview on what's going on from an organization, / corporate perspective, which you as employees don't always see. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this webinar before a salary negotiation one is because I think it's really helpful to set the scene for you. Now, you understand that any organization's compensation is reflective of their compensation philosophy, of the market evaluation they've conducted, and frankly, it reflects the philosophy of the decision maker in charge. So as you are thinking about preparing yourself for a compensation conversation, it is critically important to get an understanding of your value in the market. So it's your turn to do some research with the goal of learning what your value is, as well as the comparable market value of a role that you're aspiring to get to. Now, when I talk about comparables, think of it in terms of buying a house. So before the bank agrees to a mortgage, they look to be sure that the value of the house is in sync with or fit with the market value. So it's the same thing with your professional value. How does the talent that you bring compare to the other talent that the organization is considering at this particular time, and what is it about your candidacy that represents top value? So if you're going to a similar role or making a lateral move, then your current compensation could be a good comparable. But if you're making a radically different decision and making a pivot in your career and you're shifting, what you've been earning might not be the best point of reference. So what are other points of reference for getting your market value? So for more recent graduates, I would be remiss if I did not point out that we have an MBA and a Master of Finance employment report that we publish yearly. So for the class of 2017, for example, our average salary was around $128. I think we only published the median, which is $125. Now, for those of you who are more seasoned, this may not be helpful for you, but if you're only a couple years out of school, then this could be a place where you could start to benchmark and use in your benchmarking. Sometimes you can find salary surveys that are done very specifically for a particular industry or a function. Now, to find these, I would recommend starting with the professional association or organization that represents your industry. Oftentimes, they are the ones who actually produce the salary surveys, or they would at least be a resource for pointing you to the right ones. You can also give a go at Googling product management salary surveys and see what you get. Now, of course, I would caution you to look at the source and the methodology, but nevertheless, you might be able to find something there. External recruiters, if you have a relationship with them, might be willing to share some of their knowledge about compensation for the various roles and markets in which they specialize. My two favorite sources of information, which I find to be the most reliable data, is doing informational interviews and getting insights from colleagues. No matter how many years of experience you have or the level you have, you should actively be identifying the work you want to do and the people in your network who can best help you understand that work and that role. So if you remember, I've probably said this before, or I know I've said it before, build your network before you need it. This is when your network comes in to be a very valuable resource for you. So I encourage you to capitalize on the information that you gather from talking with colleagues or doing informational interviews to get salary data. Now, I'm not saying this is the first question you ask somebody, but a neutral question like, what one can expect to earn in a particular role is perfectly acceptable to ask. It's okay to say in an informational interview, what are your thoughts on the compensation level for this role? You're not asking somebody to give them your salary. You're just asking them to share their views on it. Now, oftentimes people won't do that because, as I said in the beginning, compensation is an uncomfortable subject. It's like that green elephant in the room. But if it is somebody that you know well, you feel comfortable with, the context is right, think about maybe sharing your salary and asking for their reaction. I mean, obviously, this will depend on your relationship to the person and how the conversation is going, but sometimes giving up information about yourself can get you some deeper insights. People might even reciprocate. They might share their salary, or they might even go deeper and share more about the company's compensation practices than they originally intended. And then finally, I did put job descriptions here because on the rare occasion that you do see a salary or a salary bands on a job description, that can be helpful. That typically only happens with nonprofits and industries that have unionized workforces, though. Then there's online data. And I want to introduce you here to Transparent Career, which is a compensation platform that was created by two Chicago Booth MBAs a couple years ago. Unlike some of the other salary-related platforms that you may be familiar with, LinkedIn Salary, Glassdoor, Salary.com, Payscale.com, Transparent Career actually started out by specializing in MBA salaries. And last summer, we actually did a pilot project with Transparent Career, and we did it in partnership with 5 other business schools, Harvard, Stanford, Chicago Booth, Northwestern, and Columbia. And what we did is we polled the class of 2013, and we asked them to enter their salary history in Transparent Career. And that pilot project yielded the entry of 824 salaries that was entered from all 6 schools, class of 2013. So I would actually recommend, if you're going to use these online sources, that you start with Transparent Career because it's probably the most relevant for this audience. But just know that with all these sites that you see here, you're going to be required to enter information about yourself, your level of education, your work experience, and the salary tied to it if you want to get data back from that site. So if you tell your information, then you will get, in most cases, some aggregate data of entries in their system with regards to salary. And all of these platforms have their own nuances. They have their own way of displaying the data, so you might just want to dabble in all of them to see what you get as you're doing research. But it's important to mention that not all companies will find these sources to be credible because the data is typically entered anonymously and cannot be verified. So I think you should view it as just one piece of the puzzle and a point of reference, but obviously it would not be as valid as, a corporate benchmarking statistic or a salary survey from a credible source. Okay? So, moving on, and I'm just going to grab some water. So the next piece to doing all this market research is now clarifying your position in the market based on what you find out. Now, as you know, I like to use examples of alums I've worked with. So I put together a chart that I'm going to show you in a second, gathered from someone who was pursuing a senior product management role in a tech firm that was bigger than where she currently works. So just a little bit about this person. She's 5 years out of B school, has been in the product management field. So for her, this is not a shift, an industry shift, or, well, it is somewhat of an industry shift, but it's not a functional shift. What she did is she consulted various sources, and then I kind of plotted it all out, so you can kind of see some sources here. So there's networking contacts, there's online sources. She pulled a number she got from a salary survey that gave salaries for the 75th percentile of the role. So there was probably a range there. And what I did is, for simplicity's sake, I put it in a chart with a wide range, and it's anchored here by 2 salaries that were found on an online source. I think it was Glassdoor, just to kind of give you that wide berth of a range. And the meat is really in the middle, coming from more credible sources. So you can't tell somebody, or you can't think, okay, my market value is anywhere between 135 and 220. That's just too big of a range. But getting sources from a recruiter and these networking contacts who offer more credibility of these numbers, she can better figure out how to anchor herself. You also need to consider what she currently is making now, which is $150. So that is her base salary right now. And that is relevant because she is looking to grow in the role that she currently has. So given all this, and again, you could also add other variables in here and get a lot more data. You could slice and dice it based on location, based on company. But for purposes of this conversation, what I did here is I'm proposing that she considers a salary range of about 185 to 200K that she chooses to have in discussions as it relates to her market value. You want to anchor high, but you need to be fair and realistic. And so what I was thinking is, with her current base salary of 150, anchoring around 185, because she has that specific data point, and then up to 200, which is also a salary survey data point that she can point to, is pretty much like a little over a 20% increase in terms of her salary, which is a nice jump for her, and it's also reasonable. So that's the range that I am suggesting, and what you're obviously going to have to make this personal for your own career trajectory and what you're choosing to do, but that you propose a range for yourself based on the data that you gather that will allow you to be fair and reasonable, but also just a little higher, okay? So the bottom line is that finding your market value and getting comps in the market is critical. You're going to need to invest time to do research. Your goal is to determine a good salary range for your market value, or the market value of the role you're targeting, so that you can effectively position yourself in the conversations that you're about to have. And the other questions that you'd want to consider when clarifying your position in the market: what is the demand for your skill set, right, in your particular industry or your target industry? What other opportunities are available to you? These things might merit their own research, which can also be done, online or through networking conversations as well. So digesting where we've been at so far, because I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. You've now learned that compensation is difficult and a complicated topic to discuss. You know there are different components to a comp structure, and that the biggest challenge for you is really to understand your position in the market and clarify your position in the market. So now we get to the fun stuff. We're going to shift, and we're going to talk about some actual dialogue. Now, there's a prevailing myth that negotiations or compensation conversations are all about opposition. It's like a tug of war. So you see these people here sitting on opposite ends of the table. Now, most people tend to approach salary discussions with this perspective that I've got to hold tight to my position, and the recruiter or the HR person is going to hold tight to their position, and it's going to be like a tug of war. But I don't think it has to be that way. So let me swipe that image to the side, and here's what I'd like to propose. In conversations, it does not have to be oppositional. In talking to recruiters over the years and people in HR, I have found that recruiters, while they do need to maintain internal equity, generally want to be helpful, and they want to hire people who are happy about the compensation package that they receive. So if you are a desirable candidate, they will try to be flexible with you if possible. They want you to be happy. They're not necessarily trying to hire people as cheaply as possible. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that, but it is the exception rather than the rule. And I would, of course, like to think that our MIT Sloan alumni are immune from that. So I'm going to have to check my notes here. I want to challenge you all to approach compensation conversations as if you're getting on the same side of the table as the recruiter. So assume the recruiter is motivated to have a constructive and collaborative conversation with you. Remember that they want the people they hire to perform optimally. So how do you cultivate this partnership and try to approach it like you're on the same side of the table as the recruiter? You're going to use conversation to do this. So let's look here at the different stages of the compensation conversation relationship here. The type of conversation you have is going to vary depending on where you're at in the process. You're going to have a very different kind of conversation if you're a passive candidate and a recruiter approaches you versus being an active candidate when you're actively seeking a job and you might be reaching out, as to when you're in process talking with someone from HR or a search consultant and then getting to a hiring manager and then a final stage as you get to an offer. You're going to have a different conversation at each step. So let's look at some dialogue here. Now, I want to remind you, again, that compensation and negotiation are not a one-size-fits-all type of solution, right? So these conversations here are going to be highly individualized and tailored to each person's background, their career objective, the company compensation philosophy, what conversations have occurred so far, who the players are. There's a lot of variables that come into play here. So I'm going to give you some actual dialogue to use here, but I do want to make sure you understand and that you need to consider the context of the conversation you're having before you just use these phrases, okay? So let's say you're a passive candidate and a recruiter approaches you about a job opportunity and they ask, what would you be looking for as a base salary? Now, I suggest you respond with something like this. I haven't properly researched the market value for the role. Can you please explain the general compensation structure for this position? Is there a range you've been asked to work within? Now, the method I'm going to be using here tonight has a formula. You get asked a question, you acknowledge the question and respond to it, but then you add a question of your own. And that really opens up the conversation. I do also want to pause and note the footnote here. These responses were created by my colleague, Patty Reich, who is at the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. I think Patty's formula of opening up the conversation by posing a question at the end is a brilliant formula, and she has given me permission to share her ideas and phrasing here. Now, the next question you might be asked by a recruiter is this. What are you earning currently? I wish I could ask you all what you would say, but this is a webinar. So let me just tell you, at this point, it's none of their business. So you can actually respond with, at this stage, I still consider that confidential. Now, this next level brings a different dynamic. Now let's say you're an active candidate. You're approaching others, you're networking, you're introducing yourself. You could be talking to somebody in your network here. You could be talking to an employee at a target company or perhaps a recruiter. So in this dialogue, you might be asked again, what would you be looking for in a base salary? Now, this is where all the research that you've done will be brought into the conversation. It's fine then to say something like this. I've done some preliminary research and see a range of 185 to 200K base for this level of work. What are your thoughts on this? So again, you're responding to the question, you're asking a question of your own. This opens up the conversation. Now, let me stop here and say, I know there are opinions that you might want to stonewall at this stage. Many people think they should, but in my opinion, I think it does no harm to respond with real numbers and provide a range. You're going to be working in a range. And I would rather you earn valuable relationship points by giving a response that's fair than by just dodging the question. In particular, recruiters, HR, search consultant people, they need to know this information. So I think it can damage your rapport to hold them off. And I think it's also, if you've done your market research, a confidence play to use something like this. It says, I've done my research, I know my value. What does it look like from your perspective? All right, if you're asked what you've been earning at this point, it gets a little tricky because maybe you disclose, maybe you don't. Again, it's going to depend on the context of the conversation and your relationship with the person. But the important thing is for you to make it clear that what you've been earning is for a different role. So it might be your earning history, but it's not necessarily reflective of what you could earn or what a comparable salary might be for the role that you're discussing. So you could say something like this. My current role is different than the one we're discussing, so it's not comparable, but, and then you could give a range. I'm in the middle 100s. You could also decide to answer with your total comp package. So you could factor in base plus bonus plus equity, and you could say something like, all in, my total comp package is close to $200,000 this year. Now, do you give up something by disclosing this? Is this going to hurt you? At this stage of the game, this is why I want you to be very attuned to the situation and the context. You really have to decide how comfortable you are, how confidential you want to be with the job search, and really where you're at in terms of a relationship and rapport perspective with whomever you're speaking. I also want to mention with this question, what are you earning currently? There are laws that have been passed or are being passed in certain states. Massachusetts is one of them, California, and I think New York, that are passing non-disclosure laws. So it's actually illegal for someone to ask you this question. So you definitely want to check your laws in your region of the world. So now you're moving the conversation along and you're talking to somebody within HR or a search consultant. So know that at this stage, the responsibility is on them to screen for a knockout factor. It simply will not do for you not to talk about salary at this age because they can't be far off in terms of where they're benchmarking you. So at this stage, you can typically say more. It's a deeper conversation. So when you're asked this question, what would you be looking for as a base salary? Open it by acknowledging that it's actually an important conversation for both of you. This signals that you're prepared. It says, money is not an elephant in the room, right? It's a business discussion. Let's have it. Then you bring up the market research that you did, right? And then you wrap it up. I've seen the base salary range. How does that compare to what you've seen? Now, remember, this is about getting you and your, conversation partner on the same side of the table. So together, you're establishing a ballpark. It's really a confidence play. You want to know how you can work together. The other pieces, again, for those who are more senior and you might know that equity is going to be a big part of the conversation, you would say something like, how are incentives going to factor in? You want to go ahead and bring up equity or bonus structure because at the senior level, that variable pay can be huge. If you're asked what you've been earning, I think at this stage of the game, it is important to be upfront here. It's okay to preface it by saying something like, well, my current role is different than the one we're discussing, so it's not comparable, right? But you really, in my opinion, do not lose by citing your earning history here. If anything, you demonstrate a level of cooperation that's going to give you relationship capital and could possibly help you down the road. Likability is powerful, and it can work in your favor, so just think about this. Now, sometimes I get objections. I hear people say, well, if I'm giving a range, what's going to prevent them from offering me the lower end of the range? I want to get 200K, and I only am going to get 185K. So situation, I would say that's where negotiation is going to come in. But if you want to mitigate this risk early, you could add something like, it's still early in the conversation, but if I'm the right person and you're able to see the value I'm adding or I'm able to add, I hope you'll bring me in at the higher end of the range. So you could say something like that. Okay, and I actually have another phrase in my next slide when you're talking to the hiring manager that will help mitigate that as well. Now remember, at this point, you're still offering a range. You're not talking about specifics. There's no dollar amount yet. You're still interviewing. You're still learning about the company, the role, the success factors. So what might be an acceptable comp package might not be clear yet. All right, now you are meeting with the hiring manager, so things are getting real, right? Now, the hiring manager is going to be focused more on your skill set, your fit, than they really are about the salary. But these questions could very well come up. And so this time you add, you use the same receptive language that I mentioned in the prior conversation where you say, I'm glad you brought that up because it's important to both of us. Then you talk about your market value of the role. And your question that you pose here is, how does that fit within the company's compensation structure? Now, this is the first time you're using that kind of language, right? Before it was, what are your thoughts on this? Or what have you seen? But now, by asking this question, you're demonstrating that you understand that there's internal equity at play and that it's important. And you're echoing that you understand their interests as well. And the more that you do that, the more cooperative the conversation will be. And hopefully the more smoothly things will go for you down the road. And then the other thing that I like to add, and again, when you're talking about giving a range and worried about getting, an offer on the lower end of the range, to mitigate that risk, what you could say is something like, I'd like to come in at a competitive level and be situated to succeed in both the short and long term. In terms of what you're earning currently, this is where you're going to want to perhaps signal that you are looking for growth opportunities. So my compensation is around this. It's different than the role we're discussing, so it's not comparable, but I'm looking for growth opportunities where I can leverage my expertise. So that implies that you then would be looking for a higher salary and an increase in your compensation. Again, you'll want to be mindful of how the conversation is going and the rapport that you're building or have established with the hiring manager. Okay, and then we're at the final stages here. You might be in the last round interview, and you might be asked this question again. What would you be looking for in a base salary? Now, some candidates want to put out what they're looking for and anchor really high. Some candidates want a company to make the first move and respond to that. So I suggest that you tee it up with this type of framework. I'd like to come in at a competitive level so that I can be prepared to succeed in the short and long term. I hope you'll propose a package that you think makes sense given our conversations thus far. From your perspective, what parameters do we need to work in? And that's a really good question to show that you're attuned to and you understand the interests of your compensation conversation partner, whoever that may be. It's really an invitation to open up the conversation and continue that dialogue. Okay? So I hope this dialogue is helpful in giving you some phrasing. And if nothing else, what I want you to remember is that formula I gave you. Respond to the question, ask a question of your own. So now let's move to preparing for an offer. The first area of focus is going to be you. Now, when you're preparing for an offer, and all these tips, by the way, also go for preparing for an interview, what do you want to do? You want to be very locked in on your core competencies and how you've leveraged them successfully in the past and how you can bring them to bear to this new potential employer or for this new role. So those of you who did not see my first career webinar, Navigating Your Career at Any Age and Stage, I encourage you to go back and look at that. You really want to get attuned to your core competencies and what you do distinctively well that is relevant to the role you're talking about. You also want to have evidence of utilizing these strengths effectively in prior roles. You always want to have short, concise, compelling stories that make your strengths tangible for to whom you're speaking. So the question that you want to ask yourself as you're preparing for an offer is, what problems need to be solved here? How can I solve them? It's really important for you to understand the needs of the employer, and you need to be framing these discussions in a way that shows they'll be relevant to the employer and also highlight your value add. You'll want to speak specifically to your skill set, and you want to make your ability to solve problems and contribute clear to an employer. You're going to take that time to ground yourself from a place of strength so that you'll be ready to talk about yourself. Next, you're going to move the prep to thinking about dollars. As I said before, you always want to have a clear sense of your market value when you're preparing for an offer. And hopefully, the dialogue we just covered and the compensation conversations you have been having throughout the interview process have helped to illuminate your market value and give you a better sense of the company's position. Now, at this stage, I would also integrate everything you know, your current salary, if it's relevant, your market value research, the conversations you've been having in the interview process. And I recommend that you set 3 numbers for yourself. A baseline number, which is the absolute minimum that you would accept, given your situation and the position in the market. A fair market salary, think middle of the road on that baseline salary chart that I showed you earlier. And then an ideal number. And that's kind of the top of the salary research chart, right? It's not necessarily realistic, but it's a number that you'd love to hit. This gives you an anchor. You know a point now, your baseline, where you'd actually walk away. And let's face it, that does happen sometimes. A lowball offer can sometimes be a signal that there's a disconnect between the work you're going to be doing and the skill set you offer. And if there's an unwillingness to negotiate on the part of the company, then sometimes you need to recognize you're going to be undervalued, or you are being undervalued, and you need to walk away rather than accept it. Or it may not make sense to accept it. But the fair and ideal numbers are really going to be your guide when you get into the salary negotiation piece. Basically, before you receive an offer, you want to have thought proactively and consciously about choosing these numbers so that you can react in more of a rational way, in a prepared way. Now, as I said, we're not going to cover salary negotiation here. Nevertheless, it's important to think about these elements that would go into a negotiation ahead of time as you prepare so that you can think about how you might respond to an offer. So you need to think about what's most important to you. What are your priorities other than getting, an optimal compensation package? And I think about it in 3 different buckets, as you see here, money, time, and then these other factors. This is going to be part of what I call your bargaining mix, the things you want to discuss or bargain within a negotiation. So let's take a look at these now. All right. Most people have a priority of obviously getting their base as high as possible. So if your base is lower than you expected, or it's not at that higher end of the range that we discussed, I do encourage you to try and negotiate that first. You should try and move it, the needle on the base, if it feels right to you. And this is the only time I'm actually going to mention salary negotiation tactics because it's relevant and it's going to inform where you go next. So if you want to ask to increase your base, you ask just that. I'm wondering if it'd be possible to move the needle on the base. Do not apologize. Do not elaborate. No explanations needed. The less you talk, the better. And then if they probe, then you bring out your unique value proposition and all the strengths and how you're going to contribute to the role at hand. Now, if the company cannot move on the base salary, what are the other things you can ask about? You could go to bonuses. Perhaps a one-time signing bonus would be available, or you could ask for an increase in the percentage of your performance bonus so that it doesn't impact that sacred salary structure. Sometimes there's more flexibility on the bonus potential the higher you go, than the base salary. And it is going to be different. I've actually worked with alums. I remember working with someone at an asset management firm where no one could earn over 130K base, So the equity was just insane. They could have variable equity. And then you have people who it's just the opposite. There's not a lot of movement with the bonus structure, but the base can be negotiated. Perhaps there are also, in addition to the bonuses, which are more short-term incentives, you could try and get some movement into the long-term incentives. This is when equity comes into play. So are there other forms like increased stock options that would increase the value of the total compensation package? In some scenarios, equity can surpass base. So you want to move to incentives to get your total compensation package higher. That also comes into play with startups as well. Other things with money, you could also ask, if appropriate to your particular situation, if they could fully cover any relocation expenses you have or increase the package that they're offering. So other things that might be negotiable or put into your bargaining mix, if they're important to you, involve time or have a time horizon. You could ask for an earlier adjustment in your compensation or an earlier review, say 3 months or 6 months after you've proved your worth and after you've shown them what you can do. Would it be possible to increase my salary to X amount? You could also ask for increased vacation days if that's important to you, a particular start date, or perhaps a certain schedule that you like. Maybe you want to work a different type of schedule, 7 to 3, instead of, I don't know that anybody works 9 to 5 anymore, but face time in the office in terms of your schedule, or flexibility in working remotely. Could be something that could be of critical importance to you, depending on the age and stage of your career and your responsibilities. Perhaps that can balance out a salary, the money piece that might not be where you want it to be. Other things that might be important to you, you could ask for a title change. There's professional development. Perhaps you want to get certified, or you want to take some classes that's going to directly impact your ability to perform in your job. This could be brought up. For more senior people, I've seen asking for kind of that corner office, better workspace, increased budget, or resources for the teams you're going to be leading. Those could be on the table as well. You might also have some room with what the content of a non-compete or a non-solicit agreement might be. Obviously, you'd want to have an employment lawyer look at your offer before you try to negotiate on this. So again, the important thing here is for you to be aware of what your particular needs are at this period of time. You might remember the required desire list that I suggested that you draw up in my first webinar. In prioritizing these items, this is where you directly draw from that. But I always recommend that you start by trying to negotiate your base pay or the equity that you're offered, whatever one of those is going to allow you to most maximize your compensation package. And then you go from there according to the order of importance that you've determined. We also just want to look at the company side too. So you've prepared yourself, you're clear on your numbers, you've got an idea of how you want to approach a negotiation and the priority things that you want to ask, the order of priority. But there are important factors to consider from a company perspective as well. The intentions, the interests, the values of the firm, as we discussed in the beginning, what is their position in the market, and their compensation philosophy. You want to take that into consideration, what you've learned so far during the interview process. You should also know that employers will expect some negotiation. And unfortunately, only 37% of people will negotiate their salary, which is crazy to me. I'll say in the work that I've done, having advised alums here at Sloan for the last 6 years, but working with MBAs for 18 years now, I see a huge difference in the willingness of women to negotiate versus men that I've worked with. So one of my favorite things to do is empower women to negotiate and ask for more. You don't lose anything by asking. As long as you do so appropriately, respectfully, professionally, and fairly, you can always ask for more money. The worst case scenario is that you get told no, and then you can graciously accept or decline the offer. However, one thing to remember, of course, is that you will still be being evaluated throughout this process. So the way you conduct yourself is paramount to your success in negotiating at a later date, and even your reputation as a new hire. So companies evaluate you throughout this process. If you conduct yourself inappropriately, rudely, disrespectfully, or make unreasonable asks or seem greedy, companies can rescind the offer. I have seen this happen. Now, I'm going to wrap up because I know we're getting close to the end. So I want to close by reviewing our major takeaways. Hopefully now at the end of the evening, you now have a new understanding of how employers approach setting compensation structure. You know how critically important it is for you to get your own market value and get a handle on that, as well as clarifying your position in the market. You have some actual dialogue to use in moving forward in your conversations, and you're also aware of all those things that you must consider when you're preparing to receive an offer. So I'm going to bring back this big green elephant to close. Hopefully it doesn't seem so gigantic and complex anymore. I hope this webinar has helped take away some of those confusing and intimidating ideas around having salary discussions. I hope you feel empowered to do your own research and approach these conversations from a place of strength rather than positioning yourself on the opposite side of the table as the person you're speaking with. And I hope you feel that now you have a toolkit to get on the same side of the table as the recruiter or the partner that you're talking to at a firm of interest or a potential employer. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions. I think I'm going to move on. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Bryn. As a reminder to our participants, you can type your questions in the Q&A box on the right side of the screen. So while you're doing that, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our next MIT Sloan Alumni Online event. So on July 18th, we have Kevin Flake, MBA class of 2016, who will discuss Wounded by War but Never Broken, a Green Beret's Lessons in Resilience. You can register on the MIT Sloan Alumni Online website, where you will also find links to previously recorded sessions. And very soon we'll have announcements about our upcoming lineup for the fall, so stay tuned for that. And briefly, we'd like to acknowledge the support of our alumni and friends who have made a gift to MIT Sloan. MIT Sloan Alumni Online is made possible by contributions to the MIT Sloan Annual Fund. The MIT Sloan Annual Fund supports groundbreaking research, student fellowships, and program development. And this year, we've set an ambitious goal of raising $6 million. So if you have not yet made a gift this year, we encourage you to do so before June 30th by visiting our website, mitsloan.mit.edu. So thank you for your support. And now we can move on to your questions. So we'd like to start today's Q&A with a spotlight question that was submitted during registration. So our first question comes from Jennifer Tretton, MBA class of 2009 from Redondo Beach, California. She asks, should MIT Sloan graduates expect a salary premium for having graduated from a top-tier school?
Okay, so first of all, I don't know if Jen is watching, but I actually remember her as a student. I think her last name was Jang Ben, but that's so funny. Hi, Jen. Thanks for your question. So the answer to this is, when you are immediately out of your MBA, 2 to 3 years out of your MBA, then yes, I do think the premium for being an MIT Sloan MBA is real. However, the longer you're out, the reality is you're going to be judged more on your value in the marketplace, the work you've done, the roles you've held. So the MIT Sloan degree will always be looked at as a credible degree, a distinguished degree. You have a great pedigree by having a Sloan MBA, but you can't use that as a fallback. You really are going to be judged on your work and the value that you've brought to the roles that you've held. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you, Bryn.
Yeah.
Another question that has come in. First, actually, we'll start with an anonymous question from one of our viewers. How willing are employers to compensate for walking away from long-term incentive pay? For instance, bonuses that have a multi-year vesting.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it depends. I mean, I've worked with several alums who have negotiated. Their new employers are willing to pay the bonus that they're walking away from. Long-term equity, I haven't seen that as much, but there have been, for example, I know I'm working with someone who's thinking about leaving. There's a bonus coming up. The closer we get to the bonus, she's actually going to bring that up. Are you willing to pay the bonus that I'm going to be walking away from in order to have me join your team? They've had some preliminary conversations, and the employer has been open to this. So I think the answer is yes, possibly. It depends. I think it's going to depend on timing. If you're due to get your bonus in February and March, and you're having this conversation in December, maybe. If you're thinking about walking away from a bonus that you're not going to get for another 6 to 8 months, maybe not as that may not be, an employer may not be as amenable to that. So again, the answer is, like it was with my first question, yes and, or yes but, it depends.
Great, thank you. Another question that has come in. If you think you have pushed the conversation too far, what's the best way to back up to an agreeable place or kind of reset?
Okay, well, I guess I want to know what you mean by too far, but here's what I would say in general, right? If you think you've mishandled something on your end during these conversations, I think, honestly, I am all about integrity, transparency, and owning it. So perhaps you reach out, and I would do this during a live conversation. I don't think it's a good idea to have negotiation-type stuff happening via email, but I would have a conversation. I might even proactively reach out and ask for a phone call or a meeting. And I would say, I've been thinking about the conversation we had, and I perhaps overstepped, or perhaps I came off in a bad light when I said X, Y, Z. I'd like to reset and tell you how excited I am about the role and how much I think I can contribute or add value. That's probably how I suggest that you do it, but there might, I don't know the particular details of your situation. Bottom line, I would own it, I would apologize, and I'd ask for a reset.
Thanks, Bryn. And we have about 2 minutes left, so time for one more question.
Okay.
What do you think about transitioning from a more typical corporate salary structure into a startup environment? And how might our alumni mitigate some of the risks in making that change from a corporate structure to a more startup or more fluid environment?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing to know is that when you're moving from a larger corporate structure and you're going to a startup that doesn't have the same kind of assets that a corporate structure has, you're going to have a different type of compensation. So there's a risk there. Going to a startup, you're typically going to be, you're not going to have a base pay that might be comparable to when you're leaving. The value typically comes in the equity. But the equity at a startup is not always, a done deal. It's going to depend on, are they kind of an early stage startup? Are they Series A, Series B, Series C? The risk gets less and less the more the company's growing. But I think that's just a conscious choice that you have to make. Not everybody can make that choice, and to run the risk of not having a guaranteed salary. So I think you need to be intentional about why you're interested in a startup, the value you can get from working at a startup rather than a bigger, firm. And I work with a lot of alums who don't want to be a big cog in a wheel anymore, and they like to go somewhere where they can really help build and grow an organization. That's fantastic. Just know that when you're doing that, you're going to run the risk of not having that guaranteed comp that is as comfortable as you might have had once before. The equity packages, I mean, you can only negotiate so much. So I think you need to, again, think about that baseline number. What's the minimum you need to get by, and start there. Does that help?
Great. Bryn, thank you so much for another terrific program, and we appreciate you so much and your time. I want to thank all of our viewers for joining us. To keep this conversation going over social media, please use the hashtag SloanEatChat. As today's event comes to a close, please take a moment to complete the brief survey that will automatically pop up on your screen. And thank you for joining MIT Sloan Alumni Online.